Before we begin the story of why does a crow keep leaving coins on this man's windowsill? A whispered tale of memory and mystery, I invite you to get comfortable. Let the world fade for a while. If you find yourself drawn into these quiet tales, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps more stories find their way to the firelight. Now, let's begin. It started with a sound. A soft clink, like a coin finding its place among porcelain. Elias stirred beneath woven blankets as the pale morning pushed faint light through the gauze of his curtains. The fog was thick today, thicker than usual. It sat heavy outside his window, like a held breath, smudging outlines of the garden fence, the trees beyond, and the world behind that. He rose slowly, bones murmuring complaint, slippers brushing floorboards smoothed by years. The kettle clicked to life behind him, unseen, forgotten. Something else held him, the coin. It rested there, neatly balanced on the ledge of his bedroom window. Ridged edges, a dull gold warmth that didn't belong to the season. It hadn't been there when he closed the curtains last night. It gleamed faintly in the pale light like an eye half shut. Elias didn't move. It wasn't the first. By now, he knew how to recognize the weightless hush of a presence. He turned toward the window. There he was, again, perched on the garden's edge, just above the frost-kissed fence post. A large crow, feathers deep as ink, eyes a perfect, unreadable black. It did not ruffle its wings, did not caw, it simply stared, and Elias stared back, a tremor of something old, and not unpleasant, prickling his spine. He opened the window, as he had so many times in recent months. Not to chase the bird away. No, never to do that. To listen. He picked up the coin. Heavy, old, worn smooth in places. A language he couldn't quite name nestled around the edge. There was a notch in it, clean, precise, as if something sharp had taken a tiny bite. "What do we have today, then?" Elias whispered. The bird blinked. Once. Slowly. The coin was clean. Too clean to have been buried. Too old to be recent. If he set it beside the others, the button, the rusted brooch, the French Louis d'Or missing its image, he imagined it would hum faintly to them, sharing secrets beneath their breath. And yet this one felt different, as if it had been waiting for someone to pick it up and remember. Elias did not ask for any of them, had never once spoken of need or want. But the crow came all the same, with trinkets clasped in its clever beak and drops of impossible memory woven into the gifts it left behind. Outside, the fog curled softly around the bird's perch like rising smoke. The crow turned its head, just slightly, and Elias felt the pressure of being seen, truly seen, by something not quite animal. He opened the window wider. And from somewhere deep in the mist, a hollow wind slipped through and whispered a name he had not heard in decades. The crow stayed. So did the silence. And the coin waited, cool and patient in his palm, daring him to ask the question that had begun to circle his thoughts with impossible wings. Why him? Why now? Why would a crow bring a coin to a man who asked for nothing? Elias was not a man who expected much from his days. He rose with the light, tended the same small garden he had kept for 20 years, and watched the moss march quietly up the brickwork of his cottage like time in slow motion. He did things in gently repeating loops. Herbal tea in the blue-spotted mug. Bread warmed on the radiator. A book whose corners curled from years of being held just so. Outside, the town barely stirred before 9. By then, Elias had already spoken to the birds. He didn't call it speaking, not really. More like remembering aloud, sharing the types of things no one else asked to hear. What the moon had looked like the night before, or which neighbors' sheets had been left out in the fog. Whether the lavender needed trimming. The birds didn't seem to mind, especially the crow. The crow, unlike the doves and sparrows, never fluttered or flinched. It simply watched. Elias had named it Elliot, though he wasn't certain why. The name had arrived one afternoon as naturally as breath. He said it once, under his breath, as the bird preened itself near the windowsill. The crow had stilled, looked directly at him, and so the name stayed. Elliot came most mornings, though not always. Elias never asked for constancy. He would set out his usual offerings, a slice of apple, a corner of toast, balanced carefully on the cracked dish outside the window. And more often than not, it would be accepted. In return came the trinkets. A button like polished garnet. An acorn cap dipped in something shimmering. A brooch, its clasp broken, the gilt roses on its face dulled by years. Objects that seemed plucked not just from the earth, but from time itself. Elias said little when he picked them up, but he always laid them gently on the windowsill inside, where they caught the light at odd angles. Something in him recognized them. Not the objects themselves. Most were unfamiliar, but the gesture. As though these were not just gifts, but fragments. Pieces of some puzzle that didn't need solving so much as witnessing. He had lived many years in quiet. Not unhappily, no, but with a sort of drifting stillness. Since Lillian died, since the last of his siblings scattered across countries and time, Elias had found comfort in the hush. Even celebration in it. Not many people knew how to be alone without being lonely. But Elliot had changed the quiet. Now it whispered with expectation. With mornings softened by ritual. There were moments, brief and startling, when Elias would feel himself smile before remembering why. He wouldn't say he loved the bird. That would sound foolish. But there was something between them. Some thread, pulled taut across place and history, binding man and feather. It was not tethered by language or need. Just presence. And silent recognition. When neighbors came by, rare, but not unheard of, they'd sometimes see the objects lined up inside his windows like offerings to no god they could name. They'd ask, curious but careful, what are all those? Elias would shrug. Presents, he'd say, and if pressed, a friend brings them. He never mentioned the crow by name. Some things belonged only to the quiet, and to those who lived comfortably within it. One neighbor, Mrs. Bexley, had once joked, maybe you're being courted. Like in those folk tales. Better watch out, you'll be swept away. Elias had chuckled, politely, distantly. But the comment nestled in his mind. Not for the courtship. Not even for the magic. For the idea that someone, or something, might choose you simply because. With no transaction, no debt, just the echo of kindness returning by wing. He kept a small wooden box beneath the sill. Not locked, just hidden. Inside were 14 gifts. He never counted aloud, but he knew. The 14th had arrived today, the golden coin. It hadn't dulled like the others. Its warmth lingered. Later that evening, after dusk had softened the hard edges of the world, Elias would lay it carefully beside the others. He would light his lamp, open a book, and forget what page he'd started on. Because part of his mind now drifted elsewhere, toward a question feathering sleep, too light to land. Why would a creature, wild and winged, come back again and again to a man who asked for nothing at all? It had been a spring morning, not unlike most others. The kind where the trees had begun trading secrets in the form of pale green leaves, and the earth still held the sleep-heavy scent of thaw. Elias had sat, as he often did, on the bench just past his garden gate, watching the world exhale into bloom again. The bench was old, cedar faded to silver, softened by moss at its legs. It groaned under him like an old friend, sharing its aches. He liked that sound, the small reminders that time was still moving, even when everything else seemed still. The birds were restless that morning, sparrows flitted like ideas between branches, and the occasional robin darted towards the soil with intent. But Elias wasn't watching them. He was stirring milk into his tea when the shadow fell. Not fast, not startling, just a widening of something above, like a thought stretching its wings. He lifted his head. The crow was still then, standing just beyond the garden path, where the flagstones disappeared into the ivy. Its feathers looked wet, though no rain had fallen. Beads of water traced silver lines along its body, as if it had come from a lake rather than sky. It didn't blink, didn't move. Elias bent forward just slightly, his hands still wrapped around the cup. "Hello, then," he said softly. The crow tilted its head. He reached into his coat pocket by instinct. Half a biscuit, honeyed, forgotten, wrapped in a fold of paper. He crumbled a piece off, extending a shaky hand toward the bird the way one offers peace without expecting it. The crow took 2 slow steps forward. And then another. Its beak moved, precise, silent. It did not snatch the offering the way others might. Instead, it leaned in, touched the crumb with its beak, and paused. At its feet, almost hidden in the clover, something small shone. Elias squinted. A red ribbon, worn, frayed at the edges like something long held by a child's hand. He reached for it, unsure, the crust still in his other palm. The bird didn't flinch. As his fingers touched the ribbon, it stepped back, one slow step, and waited. They sat like that for a moment, the air between them full of nothing. No birdsong, no wind, just the weight of a gesture. Elias looked at the ribbon. Faded red, tied in a knot that had no beginning. He whispered, though to whom, he wasn't sure, "Where did you find this?" The crow said nothing. It merely turned, slow and deliberate, and flew up, not far, only to the garden's low stone wall. It watched Elias carefully, feathers still dripping. The biscuit piece lay forgotten. That night, Elias placed the ribbon beside his teacup. Not with the others, not yet. This one felt different, personal. He dreamed of his sister, long past, her voice tangled in nursery rhymes. Of a ribbon once tied around a stuffed rabbit's neck. Of sunlight on a windowsill in a home that no longer stood. He woke before dawn. The ribbon was still there. And outside, though the branches swayed in the wind, only one crow remained. Still, watching, waiting. It began to happen quietly. A rhythm that grew, feathered edge by feathered edge, until it filled the hours between daybreak and dusk. Most mornings, the crow would appear before the kettle had boiled. It would land without ceremony on the same stretch of iron railing just outside Elias's kitchen window. Never tapping, never calling out, just arriving, like a thought he had expected without knowing. Elias no longer needed to peer through curtains. He would feel it, a subtle change in the air, like the pause before the next line in a poem. And he would turn, and Elliot would be there. He left food in the same place every day. A blue-glazed ramekin, a small porcelain thing chipped on the lip, which once held his mother's marmalade. In it, neat offerings. Slices of apple too crisp for his teeth, crumbs of scones he no longer baked but bought in twos, the occasional soft bit of cheddar wrapped in thin paper cracked at the edges. And, almost always, the food would vanish before noon. He tried not to watch too closely. He resisted the impulse to linger at the window. Somehow, it felt like interrupting something sacred. Instead, he returned to his books, to the slow discipline of pruning herbs, to tracing the fine lines of weather on old photographs he no longer remembered taking. But sometimes, inevitably, his curiosity would win. And on those days, he'd find something in return. Not always, and never predictably. But there, nestled beside the empty ramekin or resting on the windowsill's worn beam, would be a gift. A tiny gear, perhaps from a watch. A clipped corner of foreign postage, edges scalloped with time. Once, a bead shaped like a cat's eye, swirled with green and amber. Another time, the back of a brooch, missing its pin, stamped with the faint outline of a thistle. Each one placed deliberately. Each one cooled by morning fog, smelling faintly of bark, or stone, or the cindery scent of rain. Elias began storing them in a cigar box he'd secretly loathed when he first received it, a gift from a cousin he'd not seen in decades. He set it beside the bookshelf out of habit, then ritual, and then, perhaps, reverence. He did not tell anyone. Not the postman, who once remarked on the crow's strange boldness. Not the clerk at the bakery, who pointed out, with a wink, that he'd started buying apples again. Not even Rhoda next door, who fed the neighborhood fox and believed they were reincarnated spirits of old friends. Even she, to Elias's surprise, had never asked about the objects. The trinkets grew in number. After a while, Elias no longer knew if he anticipated them or if they simply became part of his home, like dust motes in a shaft of afternoon light. There was comfort in it, not in the objects themselves, but in their arrival. Each one attested to a visit. To a silent, unseen exchange. To something woven not with words but with repeated kindnesses. He began speaking more openly to Elliot. Not long monologues, but soft thoughts spoken aloud while slicing toast or watering thyme. "This one looks like it came from a music box, do you think?" he'd murmur, holding up a little crank lost of any companion gears. Or, "She used to keep these in a jar by the fireplace, when he found a broken comb's tooth, split and smoothed at one end." Whether Elliot understood didn't matter. What mattered was the space the bird occupied now, not just in his garden, but in his mornings, in his breath, in the tender gaps between silence and recollection. There was something familiar in it all. Not memory, exactly, but resonance, as though the universe had shaped a small echo just for him, wrapped it in feather and ritual, and sent it fluttering down the chimney of his life. And Elias, for all his quiet skepticism, had opened the window, again and again, without needing to know why. Elias took to saying the name softly in the mornings, like a prayer that didn't belong to any faith. "Good morning, Elliot," he'd whisper, opening the latch on the kitchen window. The name felt less like something given and more like something remembered, plucked from a place deeper than memory. He had once known a boy by that name, long ago. A cousin of sorts, or a neighbor, perhaps. Someone who had drowned, or maybe vanished, when they were no older than 10. Elias was never sure if the name had come from memory or dream. But once spoken aloud, the crow had answered with a tilt of the head. And that had been answer enough. By the 3rd or 4th month, their routine took on the weight of ritual. Always the ramekin, now softened from washing and sun, always the same hour, the same small offering from Elias's hand. No words needed, unless Elias felt them swell up, stories about books he'd once read, quiet remarks about the way the frost took longer to melt this season. Elliot listened the way no one else did, completely still. In Elias's world, even stillness could be a kind of language. Sometimes, neighbors would wave from the street. A mother with twin boys once paused to ask, "Is that your pet?" Elias shook his head, smiling faintly. "No," he said, "just a visitor." The mother looked unconvinced, but the boys didn't question it. They watched the bird with wide-eyed reverence. Children often recognized wonder without needing to explain it. Some days the trinkets came. Some days not. But Elias never measured worth by what was left behind. The silence was its own company. The visit, its own offering. There was peace in that, a peace he'd not felt in years. On Sundays, Elias started leaving small things in return. Not for exchange, but as invitation. Bits of yarn faded from the sun, a small piece of honeycomb, a shard of mirror no larger than a coin. He left them not on the sill, but on the garden bench. And over time, those gifts vanished too. There was never fanfare, nothing dramatic, just objects ceasing to be there, as though gathered into a small invisible pouch carried beneath a wing. He had stopped listening to the radio in the mornings. It cluttered the silence, filled it too quickly. Instead, he let the house wake quietly, the kettle's low rumble, the stretch and sigh of wood as the sun hit its beams, the soft thump of bird landing on iron. He rarely went into town. Not because he disliked it, but because it always felt like stepping outside a spell. The clang of shop bells, the thick scent of exhaust and perfume, it all sounded too sharp now, too fast. A world trying to name everything too quickly. Here, names did not matter. Only presence. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right and the trees spoke in their rust-colored tongues, Elias would close his eyes, hands curled lightly around a teacup, and feel that he was being watched with love, not kindness, or duty, but something quieter, older. At night, he started leaving the window cracked open, just an inch. Just enough for breath or feather to enter. It was not about waiting. It was about allowing, letting the night remind him of what the day had offered in silent increments. On the 8th morning of April, he woke to find a glass button there, a perfect oval, blue as glacier light. It shimmered even in shade. He cupped it in his palm, held it to the window, and whispered, "This one belonged to her, didn't it?" The crow said nothing, but its eyes glinted with something that might have been knowing, might have been reflection. He tucked the button beside the others, left a piece of plum in return, and sat, not to read, not to eat, just to be, quietly, within the reach of wings. Elias almost didn't notice the coin at first. It was a gray morning, the kind where the trees stood like ghosts and the fog made sounds feel like afterthoughts. He was setting the ramekin down, warmed apple and seed scattered neatly inside, when his fingers brushed something cool against the windowsill's edge. At first glance, he thought it was another button. But no, this was heavier. Flattened at the center, rimmed with soft ridges. It caught the early light in a muted shimmer, not bright, but sure of itself. He picked it up slowly. It was a coin. Gold, or something meant to be gold. Not shiny like the modern ones, but dulled to the color of autumn wheat. Its surface was worn smooth at the edges, like it had passed through 100 hands and still carried their warmth. He turned it over. There were marks, a crest maybe, laurel leaves, a figure too faded to name. Around the outer edge ran a ring of small script he didn't recognize. Not English, not French, something older, if not entirely forgotten. Elias held it in his palm like a question. The crow was there, Elliot, watching from his usual perch. Still as a carved thing, eyes catching the gold's dull reflection just once before blinking it away. "This one's not like the others," Elias murmured. The coin didn't feel like a piece of charm or detritus. It felt intentional, as though it had waited for the right moment, the right hands. He closed his fingers around it. It wasn't heavy, not truly. But it settled into his skin like something that remembered how to belong. The air shifted. Briefly, the sweetness of apple faded beneath something else. A trace of ozone, of distant rain not yet fallen. Elias stepped back from the window. He placed the coin beside the button and the gear, the ribbon and the glass bead lined upon a narrow shelf. But this one tugged the eye, as if it had something to say the others could not. He left the ramekin and returned to his usual morning chair, book open to the middle, tea steeping within reach. But the pages blurred behind his thoughts. Outside, Elliot remained unmoving. The fog clung tighter around the house, dampening sounds and wrapping the garden in a hush too deep for birdsong. Elias's thumb brushed along the ridged edge of the coin absently. A warmth sparked there that hadn't existed before, soft like memory, but colder at the edges. It reminded him of a fireplace that had long since gone out, but still bore the scent of ash and pine. The sun never appeared that day, not really. The light remained pale and high, and the air hummed with an electricity too faint for thunder. But Elias watched the window more than the clock. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that something had begun to change. And change, in his age, was a thing he had trained himself to greet gently, with both hands open. That night, as mist crept higher on the cottage walls, he took the coin once more in his hand. He held it up to the lamplight. Watching, he whispered, more to the room than the bird, "What are you trying to remember?" There was no answer. Just the steady tick of cooling pipes, the creak of a settling house. And, above all, a ringing quiet that did not feel empty. Before bed, he returned the coin to the sill. Not out of fear, but reverence. A kind of soft acknowledgement. If it was meant to belong elsewhere, the crow would know. Elliot was gone by morning. But the coin remained. The scent of dried chamomile and cracked leather rose with the steam from Elias's cup. The library book felt heavier than usual, not with weight, but with memory. He balanced it on his knees, the coin from yesterday still in his pocket like a secret too loud to forget. He didn't read that morning. Not really. His eyes traced the words, but his mind wandered elsewhere. To warmth at his fingertips. To the whisper-thin script around the coin's edge. To the shiver of something familiar wound tight beneath the unfamiliar. And then he remembered. It was the story his mother had told, years ago, or decades maybe. A quiet story, spoken in the hush between bedtime prayers and dreams not yet dreamt. She hadn't read it from a book. She was too tired for that. Instead, she sat on the edge of his bed, fingers threading through his hair, her voice low and drowsy. There once was a queen, she'd said, wrapped in a veil of grief so thick, even the sun began to forget her smile. Elias had closed his eyes then. No night could lift it. No priest could pray it away. But a crow came, dark as cloud shadow, and perched upon the windowsill of her tower each sunset. What did it do? Young Elias had asked. His mother had smiled, small and secret. It brought her silver threads, fine as hair, each one woven with something lost, a name forgotten, a hand never held, a melody that once made her weep. The threads were gifts, she'd whispered, tiny pieces of memory, and slowly the veil lifted. I thought crows stole things, he'd said into his pillow. Some do, she'd replied. But some, remember. Some bring things back. He hadn't thought of that tale in years. Hadn't even known it was still tucked inside him like lint in a coat pocket. But now, with the coin resting so warm against him, it stirred like a branch brushing glass. He rose slowly and walked to the bookshelf. His hand hovered a moment, then slid behind the third row, where books too fragile to loan out rested in dust's soft peace. There, tucked inside a copy of The Language of Stones, was an old photo. His mother, younger, laughing, holding a cup of tea. There was a small ribbon tied around the handle, bright red. Just like the one the crow had brought. He blinked. It hadn't occurred to him that the gifts might be speaking in a language he once knew. Not symbols, not messages, but echoes, remnants, threads. He sat again, breathing in the quiet. The photo in one hand, the coin in the other. The crow hadn't come that morning. But the air by the window had still felt full, expectant, like a tale half told, waiting at the doorstep of his memory. Some crows know, his mother had said. Her voice was in the back of his mind now, soft but steady. They remember old things. He stared at the coin's edge once more. He didn't know the language. Couldn't name the shape. But he didn't need to. He could feel it, that this wasn't just offering. It was returning, stitching, weaving him back to something that had waited patiently beneath the skin of ordinary days. And the question pulsed again, heavier now, but less frightening, not why the crow brought the coin, but what part of himself it had come to remind him of. The afternoon leaned quiet against the sky, clouds hanging thick and low, not quite storm, not quite calm. Elias wandered further than usual on his walk, feet tracing the soft edges of sidewalks, past hedges muted in the amber hush of late day. It was the kind of liminal light that made ordinary things seem momentarily enchanted. Outside the corner shop, the bus stop shelter stood slightly crooked, glass panels patterned with the fingerprints of many waiting hands. A young girl sat there. No more than 5, in a bright yellow coat too large for her, legs dangling above the ground like punctuation marks that had yet to decide their place in the sentence. Elias almost passed by. Something in her stillness made him pause. The air shifted, again, that silent pause between notes. The girl looked up. She didn't smile, didn't fidget. Just met his gaze as if she'd been waiting a long time for someone to pass and be still long enough to listen. Then, she turned her head toward the telephone wires above them. "There," she whispered. Perched 2 posts down, silent against the twine of wires, was the crow. Elliot. He didn't make a sound. Didn't flinch when a car rushed past. Just stayed perfectly still, watching. "He followed me," the girl said, in the soft, certain tone children use when offering a truth adults won't understand. Elias lowered himself onto the bench beside her, knees protesting. He didn't ask what she meant. He felt it in his spine. "From the hospital," the girl went on. "He sat on the window ledge the night my brother said goodbye." She swung her feet once, twice. "Mommy doesn't see him, but I do. He's not for everyone." Elias looked at the bird. Its wings were tucked in close, eyes nearly closed. Resting, or remembering. "What's his name?" she asked, sudden and bright, eyes turning to Elias's face. He hesitated. That strange ache just beneath the ribs again. "I call him Elliot," he murmured. She nodded, solemn. "That sounds right." The bus arrived then. A soft wheeze of brakes, the scrape of opening doors. The girl's mother rushed over from a nearby bench, her voice all apology and adjustment. The girl didn't say goodbye. She just climbed aboard, still looking over her shoulder. Still watching the crow. And Elliot didn't move. Only when the bus rumbled away did he blink once, slow and deep. Elias remained a while longer. Wind stirred the trees, but not the stillness inside him. He looked back up. The crow was gone. No wingbeat, no sound. Just space where something had been. But his presence lingered. A kind of quiet that said, "I was here. I'll be here again." And Elias, for reasons he didn't question, whispered a thank you into the cooling air. Not for the girl, not for the moment, but for being seen in it, even briefly, as someone the crow would choose to follow. The storm arrived before evening. It hadn't been forecast, not truly. The radio muttered about showers inland, and a chance of gusts, in the offhand way of voices that couldn't quite imagine getting wet themselves. But by 4 o'clock, the sky had bruised to a deep slate and the wind had picked up enough to shiver the ivy from its moorings. Elias stood by the garden gate, coat already damp, hands tucked inside woolen gloves thinned with age. He stared upward, not at the clouds, but at the spaces between them, where a shape might move, quick and quiet as thought. He waited longer than was reasonable. By dusk, rain had begun in soft flurries, and Elias gave up pretending he wasn't anxious. He made his way back inside, peeling wet layers off like old bark. The kettle hissed in the kitchen corner, but he didn't make tea. He lit a lamp, sat by the window, and waited. Elliot did not come. He told himself it was the weather. That birds, like people, sought shelter. That crows did not owe anything to anyone. Still, he opened the top drawer of the old dresser and gathered the small items in his palm: the ribbon, the coin, the bead that looked like a frozen teardrop of forest. He turned them over slowly, one by one. He slept lightly, the window still cracked. Thunder came in the small hours, throbbing and distant, like someone dragging furniture across the heavens. The roof creaked. The wind groaned like it had memory. By morning, the garden was scattered with leaves and broken twigs. A terracotta pot had tipped over, spilling its rosemary with the careless grace of accident. Elliot did not come that day, or the next. Elias took long walks, coat pulled close. Through the woods, under trees whispering secrets he wasn't meant to understand. He left breadcrumbs near their roots. Whistled into the hush. It wasn't that he feared a thing had ended. It was the waiting that undid him. The space where a ritual should be, now echoing like a song just out of reach. By the third morning, the air had settled. A stillness had returned to the house, not absence, exactly. Something quieter, like held breath. And there, on the sill, damp with fog but unmistakable, was something new. A ring. He stopped, hand midway to the latch. The kind of freezing you do when the world tips, and only silence can balance what comes next. The ring was simple. Gold. The edge just slightly worn from time. A pattern of leaves, barely visible now, but familiar. Too familiar. He picked it up gently. It still held warmth. His hand trembled. "Father," he said softly. Not a call. Not a question, a remembering. He hadn't seen this ring in decades. Long buried, long mourned. Lost to history, not just the family's but his own. It had once fit the finger of a man whose lap he used to curl into during firelight. A man who smiled more with his eyes than his mouth. A man they'd buried shallow, in grief-soaked haste, when the ground was too hard and money too short. The ring had gone with him. And yet, here it was. He turned it in his fingers, heart slow but certain. Out in the garden, the everywhere quiet gave nothing away. No shadow, no cry, no beat of wing. Just the damp air, and whatever had carried this thing through it. Elias placed the ring on the shelf among the other artifacts of silence. He stared at it for a long time. No tears. Not yet. Just that curious ache, old as love. The kind that knows how to wait. And from somewhere deep in the walls, or the weather, or the past, he imagined fingers like feathers brushing against memory, not lifting it, not taking, but offering it back. The morning arrived in pale shades of smoke and silver. A fragile hush lay over the cottage, lighter than fog, heavier than air. Elias stood at the window, fingers resting against the cold pane, breath fogging the glass in slow exhale. He didn't reach for the ring right away. It sat precisely where he'd left it, atop the narrow shelf beside the coin and button and ribbon, as though it had always been there. As though it had been waiting for him to become the sort of man who would recognize such a return for what it was. His hand hovered over it now. The gold held its color despite the dimness. No glare, no sheen. But it pulsed with some quieter light, like the last flame at the end of a taper. It was not an artifact now. Not a curiosity left by a clever bird. It was his father's, and it still fit. Elias slipped it over his ring finger slowly, surprised at how naturally it slid into place, no resistance, no tightness. The metal settled against his skin like a second thought, long delayed. He rested his hand on the windowsill. Outside, the frost glimmered along the fence like lace. The crow was already there, Elliot, perched on the same black post it favored above all others. It was still wet from the storm, feathers darker than night, glistening with the lingering damp. Elias lifted one hand in soft greeting, but said nothing. There were no words for this kind of moment. The kind of memory returned to you not in flash or thunder, but by wing, by beak, by ritual so quiet it pressed against the ribs. He stared at the bird, and the bird stared back. "You kept it safe," Elias whispered. All this time, Elliot shifted, only slightly. A blink. A curl of claw against iron. There were questions he could ask. How, and when, and why. But he knew now that questions were a kind of forgetting. The beauty lay in allowing the answer to simply be. Midday passed without notice. The light never quite brightened, and the kettle's whistle came late and half-hearted. Elias moved slowly through the house, ring still in place, fingers adjusting to its shape the way one adjusts to the return of a scent from childhood. He poured tea, broke bread into small, square offerings, laid them out on the sill without ceremony. When he turned back, Elliot was gone. No wingbeat, no shadow, just the food, untouched for now, and the prints of claw in frost. He returned to his chair and found himself reaching for a book he hadn't opened in years. The spine cracked slightly. His thumb found the worn indentation where the pages had soaked in candle smoke and time. And then, he read aloud. Not forcefully, not for anyone, just a voice sounding again in a room that had once held silence. He read until the light dimmed, the page blurring. And later, when he wound his watch, set the mug to soak, and drew the curtains against a December sky, he looked once more to the shelf. The ring was still on his hand. And beside it lay a new gift. A sprig of heather, wrapped in twine, faintly damp, and smelling of somewhere far away. Later that week, Elias sat beside the lamp in his study, the pale amber glow making shadows out of every quiet thing. His hands were folded in his lap, empty. The ring still circled his finger like a whispered promise, and on the shelf, among bits of memory wrapped in feathered silence, nothing new had appeared. He wasn't waiting, not exactly, but the silence sat differently now. Not like absence, like presence turned inward. He found his thoughts drifting, not forward, but back. Not toward Elliot, but toward his father. Toward the final weeks, the soft footsteps in the hallway, the rasp of breath behind a closed door, a quiet too deep for comfort. They hadn't spoken much in the end. Some men, Elias had learned even then, let go in silence. The ring had been a gift from his mother to his father. It had meant something when she gave it, and something else entirely when he was buried with it. Elias remembered the way his hands had looked then, larger, calloused, but strangely gentle. The ring had caught the light even then. He hadn't thought he'd ever see it again. He hadn't mourned its loss. Not really. The dead take what they need. That was the rule. That's what made it easier. But now it was back, not as a thief's prize, but a traveler returned. He rose from the chair, stepped slow. The scent of old paper and dried mint lingered in the room. He opened the tin where he kept old photographs, fingers fumbling for the right one. There, a small portrait, creased down the center. His father standing in the yard, one hand shielding his eyes, the other stuffed awkwardly into a trouser pocket. The ring was on his finger, sunlight glinting off its edge like a secret. Elias held it closer. He didn't cry, not truly, but the ache rose with the certainty of music that always knew its way back to the chorus. He left the photo on the mantel beside the feather Elliot had dropped last spring, dark and perfect and slightly curved. Later, he prepared a slice of apple, thin and peeled, the way his father had liked. He placed it gently on the slate ledge outside and didn't watch for it to be taken. No bird came that evening. But the wind shifted, and sometime between midnight and morning, he dreamed, not vividly, not in images, but in sound. Footsteps on old floorboards, the creak of a chair being pulled back, the scrape of a ring across a porcelain mug. He woke before dawn, the world still wrapped in velvet dark. No sun yet, no bird, just a stillness that felt, for the first time, like peace. He stayed in bed a little longer, hand curled lightly over the band of gold. Somewhere deep in the house, something sighed. The sort of breath one takes at the end of grief. Elias whispered, "Thank you," into the quilt. Not quite to the room. Not just to the bird. But to the one who carried the memory home. The hills behind Elias's cottage rose in long, thoughtful curves, soft with moss and years. On days when the wind was less insistent, he'd walk their paths slowly, letting his boots find the places they remembered instinctively. That morning, with the ring still warm on his finger and memory stirred into something more awake than usual, he brought the old binoculars. Mrs. Langton next door had offered them weeks ago, wrapped in a rusting tea towel, with the offhand remark, "You'll see things better with these, you know." He hadn't known what she meant, until now. The climb was slower than it once would have been. The grass was damp, and the heather clung thick to its roots. Elias muttered small things to himself, not stories, not names. Just breaths punctuated by cloud. At the crown of the nearest hill, he stopped. Below him, the woods held the hush of watching things. To his left, a tall ash tree bent with age, its limbs curled like fingers over something strange. There, nestled between bark and shadow, was a nest. Larger than he'd imagined, not a messy pile, not random, but constructed, deliberate. He lifted the binoculars. It wasn't made of twigs, not entirely. Silk ribbon, red, a comb tooth, a button glinting like starfall. Paper corners folded precisely, edges curled. Metal flattened into soft curves where nature would have preferred spikes. Bits of wire. A child's barrette bent gently into the shape of a loop. In its center, something smoother, a stone. Oval, pale. Scratched across its back in faint strokes was the inscription, "Come back." He blinked. Everything else softened. The wind shifted uphill. The ash tree groaned softly, as though acknowledging his presence. No crow in sight. But the feeling, that presence, that now familiar weight in the air, settled lightly on his shoulder. This was not emptiness. This was curation. A private museum of things that once mattered to someone, enough to be left behind. Elias let the binoculars hang heavy around his neck. His breath caught, not sharply, but gently. Like a word one dare not speak aloud. He sat in the grass, not minding the damp, and whispered, "Why these things?" The trees didn't answer. The nest did not move. But deep in Elias's chest, something responded. Not with words, but with shape. The gifts weren't tokens. They weren't simply cleverness or trade. They were echoes. Memories others had misplaced. Sentiments left weathering on pavements. Things imbued with a kind of lingering sorrow too quiet to mourn. And this crow, this feathered archivist, was gathering them. Preserving them. Carrying them across thresholds of forgetfulness. For him. Maybe for others, too. Elias stayed until the sun reached over the ridge behind him. Until the damp began to creep through fabric and thought. Still no crow. And yet, he felt accompanied. Down the hill, the smoke from his chimney began to unroll into the open sky. The shape of home calling gently. He stood, bones slow but sure, and made his way down the slope, one boot, then the next, back into a world that suddenly seemed more intricate than before. Not because anything had changed, but because he had seen where the remembering went. The winter came quietly that year. Not with storm or ice, but with a gentler kind of retreat. like someone pulling a soft blanket over the world and asking it, without words, to rest. The mornings arrived later. The light, when it came, was pale and uncertain, as though it had forgotten its way. Elias rose slower now, his joints murmuring in protest, the warmth of his wool sweater lingering even after noon. Each morning, he opened the window a little, just enough to admit a breath of the cold. And each morning, his eyes went searching. But Elliot didn't come. At first, he told himself the bird had gone to where the wind made room for flight. That it was seasonal, natural. Still, he set the ramekin out. Day after day, he left offerings, always simple. Apple slices that browned by afternoon, crumbs from bread too stale to enjoy. He didn't stop the gesture. Rituals like this know how to outlive doubt. The trinkets ceased. No buttons, no ribbon, no coin. Only frost edged the sill now, delicate as lace, curling like forgotten script. The little room where Elias kept each returned memory, the feather, the ring, the etched pebble, remained untouched. He found himself sitting there more often than before. Not lonely, but listening. For what, he wasn't certain. He walked the ridge path sometimes, his scarf wrapped tightly, Mrs. Langton's binoculars cold and heavy in his coat. But the nest was empty now. Windswept. Silent. Bits of ribbon still fluttered in the branches, catching the low winter sun like fading fire. The nest wasn't abandoned. No, he wouldn't call it that. It felt concluded. Back at the cottage, the window pane kissed his fingertips with chill each time he reached out. His breath steamed against the glass, curling over the prints left behind from hands repeating old gestures. He dreamt more, these nights. Dreams not filled with spectacle, but with resonance, the rustle of wing against sky, the faint metallic clink of something small being set down with purpose. Sometimes, he awoke certain that he'd heard a call. Not loud, but close. He always got up to check. Never scolded himself when he found nothing. There was no bitterness in the waiting. Some companionships give without guarantee, like a song carried by gulls miles from the sea, or the warmth that lingers on a surface hours after touch. Once, near the end of December, Elias stood by the window just after dusk. The pale blue of the sky folded delicately into gray. No wind, no bird, but across the snow, the faintest pattern emerged, not footprints, not quite. Just the suggestion of passage. Like quiet movement the world had chosen not to interrupt. He laid a bit of honey on the sill that night, though he had no reason to believe it would be accepted. The next morning, the ramekin remained full. And yet, the shape of the snow had shifted, just slightly. He stood for a long time, robe tight around him, hands spread on the chilly wood. Some absences are louder than presence. But some absences hum low, like a lullaby remembered halfway through. The kind of loss that feels less like vanishing, and more like stepping into another room you can no longer enter, but toward which you still turn your head when someone says your name. Elias made tea that evening. Used the good mug. Poured 2 cups. One sat by the window. Steam curled toward the chill. He left it there, and sat quietly, not waiting. Just remembering. The library was quieter now. Not from lack of people, it still breathed with soft footsteps, the occasional cough, the rustle of pages turning, but quieter in the way certain places become after you've carried a silence there long enough that the walls remember it. Elias moved gently between the stacks, cart rattling softly beneath his hand. He liked this work. It needed no urgency, just patience. He shelved books as though tucking them in, letting his fingertips linger a moment on worn spines. The coin stayed in his coat pocket these days. The ring, still on his hand. He rarely touched them. No need, they pulsed faintly with their own meaning, a comfort quietly pressing against the skin. That morning had offered nothing new on the sill. And the window, despite its age, barely creaked when opened. The wind had stilled altogether. He did not count this a loss. He had begun, instead, to look for other signs in quieter places. Near the end of his shift, as he returned a book on wildflower identification to a bottom shelf, he felt a gentle tap at his shoulder. He turned. A woman stood beside him, maybe in her 40s. Short dark hair, eyes that looked like she remembered too many things. She wore a weathered coat, wool scarf looped twice around her neck. She smiled, but it didn't fully reach, like her thoughts were still catching up. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Do you have a moment?" Elias straightened slowly, blinking. "Of course." The woman hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket. It was a brass key, unpolished, simple. "I think," she began, then paused. "You might not remember me. Or maybe you never saw me. It doesn't matter, really. But this," she held up the key, "was given to me. By a crow." Elias stilled. She didn't wait for disbelief. She must have seen something in his face, recognition, maybe, and continued. "It was on my porch the week after my brother died. We hadn't spoken in years, but I kept a few of his things. This key, I remembered it after I saw it. It belonged to a music box I had almost thrown away." She looked down at her hand, thumb brushing the key's teeth gently. "I didn't even know I still had it. It was stuck at the back of a closet. I don't remember putting it there." Elias's voice came quiet. "And the box?" She smiled then, faint. "It played our favorite record, chipped notes, barely there. But it played. First time in decades." She paused, eyes dark and bright at once. "I saw a crow on the roof that day. He didn't leave a feather. Didn't even move. Just waited until I turned the key. Then flew off." Elias swallowed. His chest felt full in an unfamiliar way, not pressure, not pain. Just presence. A weight that warmed instead of burdened. She tucked the key away. "I wasn't sure why I thought to come tell you. But then I saw you shelving. And I knew your face." He smiled gently, voice almost forgetting itself. "They seem to know what to bring back." She nodded. "Yes. And who to give it to." They stood for a moment surrounded by rows of forgotten names and remembered stories. Then, "Thank you," she said. Though he didn't know what she was thanking him for. Elias nodded. She walked away without looking back, disappearing between shelves like a page turning itself. He returned the book in his hand to its place, quietly, carefully. And that night, he left the window open again. Just in case another memory had found its way home. It happened quietly, as most leavings do. One gray morning in April, Elias rose to find the window already open. It startled him, just for a breath. He was certain he had left it latched the night before. But there it was now, open a careful inch wider than usual, as if the house itself had exhaled in the dark. The ramekin sat untouched. Beside it, a feather. Black as usual, but thinner. Softer. Its shaft light enough that it bent with even the smallest wind. Tied to its base, so delicately Elias didn't see it at first, was a single strand of hair. Pale, almost silver, human. He stared, not reaching, not yet. His mind lingered in the stillness. The air didn't move. Even the sounds of the world, the ticking pipes, the neighbor's dog, the crows in their distant trees, seemed to draw back and wait. He touched the feather. It was warm. Only then did he know. Elliot wouldn't be coming again. He didn't know how or why he was certain. But it settled into him like morning light on cold earth. Not cruel, not abrupt, just done. Some part of him had been waiting for this. Preparing. The rituals had grown slower, softer in recent weeks. The trinkets had dwindled to none. The silences had grown longer but heavier, not empty. Not absence, exactly. Something else. He lifted the feather and the hair with both hands, bringing them inside like a votive offering. He didn't cry. Not then. He simply sat, the window still open, and laid the feather gently across the shelf beside the coin, the ring, the gear, and all the other forgotten things that had found their way home. There would be no dramatic farewell. No silhouette cutting across the sky. No final call. Just this. A last gift. Left like all the others. Elias kept the window open all day. Not watching. Just letting. By evening, a breeze stirred the feather slightly. It turned once, then stilled. That night, Elias left no food on the sill. But he whispered a name into the dark, once. Not for the bird, exactly. But for the space the bird had filled. And for the part of himself that had once been waiting, and now, quietly, wasn't. The window stayed open. It had begun as habit, then became a ritual, and now it simply was. Like the wind's path over the hills or the way moss found its place between stones. Elias no longer checked to see if the pane was ajar upon waking. He simply assumed the house breathed that way now. The breeze moved through the space gently, lifting the edges of paper, teasing the steam from his tea. On colder days, it stirred the hem of his robe. Visitors sometimes shivered when they stepped inside. "You'll catch your death with that open," they'd say, half scolding, half curious. Elias would only smile. "I like the sound of the world waking," he'd offer, as if that explained everything. No one ever bothered to close it. No one reached out to touch the latch. Even children, brave and boisterous, would pause at the threshold of that particular window, their small frames stilled by something they couldn't name. There were no more trinkets now. The ramekin sat undisturbed for weeks at a time. Snow dusted the sill each winter. Petals drifted onto it each spring. The shelf inside bore the same remnants of that peculiar companionship: coin, button, gear, ribbon. Each one untouched but not forgotten. He never dusted them. Dust, he believed, belonged to memory. Let it cloak the objects like time's own acknowledgement. Once, during a particularly blustery morning, Mrs. Langton from next door asked the question outright. She had come to borrow time and stayed to criticize the draft. "Why do you keep that thing open?" she asked, readying her scarf with practiced irritation. "You'd be warmer, healthier, and half less likely to be buried in flannel within a month." Elias didn't answer immediately. He pressed a sprig of thyme into her palm. Then, with a quiet stillness he had forgotten how to break, he said, "Some things leave through the same door they came." Mrs. Langton did not ask again. The truth was that Elias no longer needed a reason. It didn't feel like an act of waiting. Nor of mourning. It was an opening, plain and steadfast. A gesture not of longing, but of remembrance. A space left untouched so that its touch might be felt again. When the wind was kind, he swore it carried the scent of feathers warmed in sunlight. When it was harsh, he listened to it scratch against the panes like wings brushing too close. He had long stopped reaching for answers. The rituals had become quiet household facts. The ramekin washed weekly, the shelf never rearranged. The window left open. He didn't know if Elliot would return, or if the bird had ever been just a bird at all. But what had mattered had happened. That was enough. Let time pass. Let snow come and melt and come again. Let generations shuffle past the threshold of this place with questions and cider and borrowed sugar. He would open the window each morning. And one day, when he no longer could, the wind would do it for him. When she first came to visit, she was shy. Small, with a ribbon always tipping sideways from her braid and a voice no louder than a moth's wing. Elias never asked her name outright. He only ever called her Little Sprig, and she never corrected him. She came with her mother, his niece, on rainy Tuesdays. While the adults drank tea in the cramped kitchen, she wandered. Not far. Just from bookshelf to armchair, deerskin rug to the curious shelf near the window. "Why are these here?" she'd asked once, fingertip hovering above the coin. Elias had smiled, soft around the eyes. "They're stories," he said. "From books?" "No," he said gently. "From outside." She seemed to understand in the way children do, without burden. Without needing proof. Over time, she grew bolder. Climbed into the window seat with legs tucked beneath her like folded wings. Asked questions with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew part of the answer. "Why is the window always open?" Elias stirred sugar into his tea and said, "Because someone asked me to leave it that way." "But they're not here. Doesn't mean they're gone." She nodded, accepting that. Children know how to make room for unseen things. Adults often forget. On her 7th visit, she brought a gift. It wasn't wrapped. Just cradled softly in both palms, a key. Rusted thin, like something unearthed after a long nap beneath soil and time. "I found it in the hollow tree down the path," she said. Elias bent lower, took it in his hand like one might accept the last page of a long-lost letter. It was cold. It hummed. He didn't ask what it opened. He only set it on the shelf beside the others. From then on, she brought more, half a marble, smoothed clear from age, a stamp with no country, a spoon warped like it had rested too long in the sun. She always asked questions, never the same one twice. "Do birds understand people?" "Sometimes." "What happens when a story ends?" "It waits. Until someone else is ready to tell it again." One dusk, with the sky stained lavender and milk, she perched in her usual spot and whispered, "Who do you talk to when no one else is here?" Elias rested his hand on the window frame. "To someone who listens." She considered that. Slowly nodded, then closed her eyes like maybe she, too, could hear the reply if the silence curled just right. She grew up over many Tuesdays. In increments. Slowly. The ribbon from her braid moved to her wrist. Her questions changed. But she never stopped sitting by the window, or walking the overgrown path behind the cottage, or leaving tokens on the sill when no one watched. Even when Elias grew slow with breath and trembled while passing her a biscuit, she smiled as gently as she had the first time. She never asked what would happen when he was gone. She already knew. The stories would remain. The shelf, the sill, the open pane, they had been invitations, not endings. And when she came alone, later, older but with the same wide eyes, she spoke to that window. Not loudly, but clearly. "I kept listening," she said. "Just like you showed me." And somewhere in the hush, something unseen stirred. Not an answer. Just the weight of being heard. It wasn't the coin she noticed first. It was the sound, the same gentle clink Elias used to describe. Like a thought settling into the world. She had left the window cracked, not out of habit, but because something in her bones told her to. Spring had come late that year, and her flat smelled of old lilac and paper. The wind carried the scent of rain evaporating from warm stone. Morning light poured onto the sill, turning the dust gold. She crossed the room barefoot, mug in hand, and paused. A single coin waited there. Round-edged. Touched by age. It caught the sun but didn't sparkle. It absorbed it, patiently, like something that had traveled far and arrived exactly where it meant to. She set the mug down. Reached slowly. The coin was heavier than she expected, familiar in the way a forgotten lullaby is. The edges were soft from touch, the face worn by time. There were symbols, faint, nearly erased, and she couldn't decipher them. But she didn't need to. She turned it over once, then closed her fingers around it. Something in her stilled. Footsteps from memory echoed in her ribs, the sound of a kettle warming in a quiet stone house, laughter muffled beneath years, the soft voice that had once called her, "Little Sprig." She looked up, and saw it, a shape, high against the cloud-brushed sky. Black wings curved like a question halfway asked. A crow, circling, but not in orbit. In recognition, she stepped closer to the window. It was distant, almost lost in the morning glare. But it tilted once in the air, and that was enough. She remembered then, the shelf. The objects. The stories spoken into open space. The way her hands had pressed small treasures into Elias's palm like he held the land of forgotten things. And how he had listened, every time. She set the coin just inside, on the sill. The wind moved through her curtains without hurry. No food followed, no ribbon, no ceremony, only the opening, only the stillness. Later, she would find the old key tucked in a drawer beneath half-worn scarves and notes she'd never mailed. The ring she'd made from wire as a child still lived in a shoebox under her bed. And the shelf would slowly, gently, begin to form again. Not as mimicry, not as memorial, but as memory's own echo, changing shape and name, but never meaning. Because, whether you believe in crows or coincidences, in threads or in wings, there are some stories that remember how to return. Even when no one calls them back. They call it legend, now. Not Elias, not Elliot, not the quiet spaces between them. Just a story, flattened slightly into something safe, something round enough to be passed between generations like worn stones in a pocket. The children in town whisper it outside school gates and in the lull between thunderstorms. How a crow with eyes like midnight still flies the rooftops on mist-heavy nights, seeking the windows left open, and the hearts still tethered to forgotten things. They say the crow leaves gifts, always small enough to miss if you're not looking. A spoon's handle twisted into the shape of a question mark. A silver thimble laced with dried lavender. A handkerchief so delicately aged that initials have floated off it like breath. No one sees him arrive. No one sees him go. But the offerings are always found in the morning. Never at the front door. Always on the windowsill. Always with the quiet precision of intention. The story goes, he was a man once. A man who remembered for others what they had misplaced beneath grief. They say the wind took him one winter, and in leaving, he became what had guided him, a bearer of memory, a keeper of lost pieces. They tell of the sound, not the alarm of wing or the caw of his kind, but a soft clink, like a secret being placed exactly where it belonged. Some say he only visits children. Some say he finds those who've forgotten how to grieve. Others believe he seeks no one in particular, that he's simply following the last song someone asked him to carry home. One boy in the brick house near the river claimed he woke one morning to find an old military medal on his pillow. He'd never known his grandfather. A girl swears a necklace found in the grass outside her school matched the one her mother lost before she died. They don't question it, not really. No one sees the crow in daylight. But stories of him pass through firelight and between porch steps. Parents laugh gently at the tales, though most leave a biscuit out, just in case. And when neighbors mention a coin by the hedge, a doll's eye glinting in the gutter, or a music box starting to play after years of silence, they say, Elias's crow. And something soft wraps around the name. Not reverence, not myth, but something quieter than both. A kind of remembering. Not all stories end when the characters leave. Some settle into the bones of places. Some take flight. And some just keep returning. The morning came slowly, as if unsure it was meant to arrive at all. Over the hills, the first light spilled like warm breath across the medallion of frost that still clung to the fields. The cottage, older now, edges softened by moss, roof lined with ivy gone silver, rested in the hush of early spring. No smoke curled from its chimney. No footprints in the dew. Inside, the wood felt quiet. Familiar. Books still lined the shelves like patient companions, their spines faded from afternoon sun. The chair beside the window bore the soft impression of someone long gone. The window remained open, always open, even now, even after. It let the air wander in. No one lived there anymore. Not exactly. But someone visited, sometimes, a girl, grown now, her shoes careful on the stone path, her fingers pausing on the latch before she eased the door open. She didn't come for things. She came for the quiet. For the remembering. This morning, dew slicked the windowsill. Her coat still damp from walking through grass, she stepped inside and brushed away a curl of petal that had clung to the frame. She moved like someone offering respect. The shelf remained just as it had been, dust-soft, lined with small things. The coin, the ring, a faded button, a gear with no machine, a single black feather crossed by a pale thread. She didn't touch anything. She never did. It wasn't reverence. Not exactly. Just knowing. Some things weren't meant to be picked up again. Her eyes settled on the sill. At first, she thought it was a trick of light. The sun, still low, brushed warm gold across the wood. But no, it was there. Small, round, familiar. A coin. Not like the others she remembered. This one was different. Thinner. Duller. Almost ordinary. Except it wasn't dusty. Except it hadn't been there before. She stepped closer. Her shadow fell across it. She didn't move it, didn't need to. She saw the faint impression near its edge. A notch, precise. Worn by time, maybe. Or by intent. She smiled. Just slightly. Not for the coin, but for the space it occupied. Someone had left a scrap of bread there, too. Just a corner. Dry, nestled against the hinge of the frame. Not hers. Someone else remembered. Someone else had passed through and decided, even briefly, that the story might still be true. The sun rose higher. The frost faded from the earth. A robin chirped nearby, tentative in its offering. On the stairs beyond the back wall, something shifted. The flicker of wing. A shape too large for sparrow. Too silent to be just wind. She didn't turn. She whispered, "Welcome back," though she couldn't say why. Then stepped from the threshold, leaving the window open, the coin glinting faintly in the dawn. The cottage settled again into its stillness. And just outside, in the warming light, a faint mark darkened the railing. Claw. Feather. Memory.